Namaskar, good evening. You're watching Nation Wants to Know and I'm Swati Joshi. Top of the broadcast, our focus is on the strong message from India to Canada. A strong statement, in fact, by the External Affairs Minister who was addressing the United Nations General Assembly, and he said that political convenience should not determine response to terrorism. Terror cannot dictate political agenda. We have Rishabh joining us on the broadcast with more details. It's a very, very strong statement and a stern message, in fact, to Canada. Highlighting and exposing its duplicity, its hypocrisy in handling the situation. The External Affairs Minister said very, very categorically, pointing out that hypocrisy. He said, you know, the political convenience cannot determine how you will respond to terrorism.
Well, definitely. If you see, this is a very smart statement coming in from External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, where without taking name, he has directly conveyed his message. The moment he says that political convenience cannot determine your reaction to terrorism, in a way has sent out a very clear message that for the vote bank, you cannot shelter terrorists in your country. Apart from that, Dr. S. Jaishankar, in his almost 20-minute long speech, very categorically mentioned that how India now represents Global South. He talked about how under India's presidency at G20, African Union was made the full-time member here, how BRICS expansion happened, and how India's national interest is always for global good. He spoke about how India has been the dost for countries like Turkey, for Syria, and during the economic crisis, even to Sri Lanka. He also talked about that how during the COVID pandemic, India's vaccine maitri helped the global south to ensure that they are not subjected to vaccine apartheid.
All right, Rishabh, stay on with us. Let's in fact play out that bite. Let's listen into S. Jaishankar speaking at the UNGA.
Mr. President, we must never again allow an injustice like vaccine apartheid to recur. Climate action, too, cannot continue to witness an evasion of historical responsibilities. The power of markets should not be utilized to steer food and energy from the needy to the wealthy. Nor must we countenance that political convenience determines responses to terrorism, extremism, and violence. Similarly, respect for territorial integrity and non-interference in internal affairs cannot be exercises in cherry-picking. When reality departs from the rhetoric, we must have the courage to call it out.
Let's in fact also open this up and go across to our guests. We're joined by Prabhloch Singh, political analyst. We have Captain Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation. And we have Teddy Milewski, author of Blood for Blood, 50 Years of the Global Khalistani Project. Good evening to all of you. I first want to go across to Mr. Milewski. Mr. Milewski, if one were to trace the origin of this issue, which has led to escalation of tension between Canada and India, one would, I believe, have to go back 45 years. And do you agree with the conclusion? And these 45 years, Canada has in fact turned into a safe haven for the pro-Khalistan groups, for the Khalistan terrorists?
I recall 20 years ago, I did a documentary for my old employer, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and the documentary was called Safe Haven, and it argued that Canada had bent over backwards to accommodate and tolerate and to avoid challenging the buildup of threats from Khalistani extremists who were living in Canada, plotting in Canada, basically free to operate in Canada. And again, that it showed my immense influence in Canada by the fact that nobody paid any attention to at all to my documentary, and the situation promptly got worse rather than better after it was broadcast. The point is that Mr. Jaishankar and the Indian side is correct. There's no way to argue. Canadians should not be arguing that they've done a great job battling against Khalistani terrorism. They looked the other way. They had the Air India bombers under surveillance for 3 months before the bombing of 1985 and still didn't figure out what they were up to, didn't do anything about it, didn't heed the warnings, put them on the shelf. They had a specific warning 3 weeks before that bombing, for example, and didn't do anything about it. The warning was from India, and it said they're going to try to put explosives in the baggage, which is exactly what happened. That's why the plane blew up. And then after the bombing, the legal system in Canada was slow, sclerotic, it was inefficient. It was specialized in seemingly throwing out valuable evidence as inadmissible, and basically everyone except one man, the lowly bomb maker, got off. Only one man was ever convicted. Now, I don't mean to go on about the Air India case, but it's symptomatic. It shows the kind of atmosphere that prevailed in Canada, and it continues today, where we now have the normalization of displays of terrorist propaganda, including martyr posters garlanded with gold tinsel, for heaven's sake, of the Air India bomber himself, Devinder Parmar, who's held up as a model for Sikh youth. Publicly, nobody says boo about it, except for people like me, and nobody listens to me, as we've already established. So we have a situation now in Canada where you can drive through downtown Toronto with a flatbed truck holding a life-size reenactment of the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984, a celebration of terrorism, an applause for terrorism, telling children that this is a wonderful thing and we're glad we did it. We're proud of this event, and nobody says boo. It's completely normal. Well, the foreign minister did say boo. She said it's unacceptable. And what happened? We accepted it. We didn't do anything about it. The same thing with these latest developments, the killer posters, for example, advertising that these are the photographs and the names of the Indian diplomats upon whose backs we are painting a target. If you want to go get them, we're offering rewards for revealing their home addresses. Isn't that pleasant? These are celebrations of terror. These are incitements to violence. And Canada, to date, has not cracked down, and Canadians need to sit up and wake up and realize that India is correct about that. Now, none of that means that it's okay if India did indeed come into Canada and assassinate a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. That's illegal. It's a breach of international law, and it's a disgrace. That doesn't mean that none of what I said indicates that it's okay to do that. But Canadians need to realize that the Indians were frustrated for a reason, and that for 40 years, those reasons have been building up.
Right. Now there are claims that there is credible evidence, but there's nothing in the public domain. I want to bring in Captain Alok Bansal. Captain Alok Bansal, has the External Affairs Minister actually hit the nail on the head by calling out the political convenience?
There is no doubt, as the previous speaker said very clearly, Canada has been following a path where actually they have been giving a tacit acceptance of terrorism. He highlighted the Air India bombing case, and in fact that case is a point case. The people were under surveillance, they tested bombs, they were still not apprehended, they carried weapons from US, they brought things. The only one individual was apprehended. He was also given a very light punishment. The punishment got aggravated because of perjury and other issues. The main masterminds were allowed to get away. Those who were arrested also managed to get away. And I think that particular bombing was the biggest aviation terrorist act before 9/11. And despite that, Canada did not. And today, you are seeing very clearly an evidence of incitement to violence. People are being told that these are Indian diplomats, they can be targeted. You are celebrating the terrorist act whereby Prime Minister of India was assassinated at some stage, and that you are advertising, that you are celebrating. So this is open incitement to terrorism. Now, you cannot have this sort of a selective decision making that you have certain citizens of yours will continue to indulge in this sort of an activities. And that's what is wrong. And I think India has said, if you have a credible evidence, please share it with us. I think Canada has not been able to do so till now.
Right. Mr. Singh, Canada is only claiming at this point of time, some in the government saying we have credible evidence, but nothing put out in the public domain. On the other hand, there is credible evidence on the streets of Canada today in form of these protests, in form of anti-India propaganda. And till today, the Canadian government fails to act, allowing all of this in the name of freedom of speech and expression.
Yes, you're right. So the way the situation is right now, it was the writing on the wall. This was a matter of time, and I would in fact put it this way, that this is A to Z in X amount of time, where A in this equation are the repeated requests from India for extradition of these designated terrorists, where Z is Niger's killing, and where X is the several years that Canada has been doing nothing about India's requests. So this is A to Z in X amount of time, and these allegations, it has been a couple of days now, and not a single evidence has been brought up in the public domain. And as we all know, it hasn't been shared with the Indian government as well. So if Canada was in such a rush, to allege that India was behind this killing, I really wonder what stopped Canada from taking any action against so many designated terrorists on Canadian soil. Doesn't Canadian values, don't they inspire Canada and the Canadian Prime Minister to take action against people who've indulged in unlawful activities? It's as simple as that.
Mr. Milewski, perhaps you can throw more light on the political compulsions that everybody is pointing out. And, the question is the current establishment or the previous establishments in Canada not worried about how this platform provided to pro-Khalistani groups or extremists or terrorists is one day going to, in fact, impact the Canadians?
Well, right from the start, the principal reason why Canada was so inattentive and so tolerant and so complacent about the threat was that it wasn't a threat against us. It wasn't our problem. The Air India bombing, even though the great majority of the victims of that bombing were Canadian citizens, never animated Canadians. Well, they were Indo-Canadians. They weren't really us. And then after that, well, they're not really threatening us. They're threatening India. Well, that's okay. They just let it happen and didn't take it seriously. Then, of course, the Air India bombing, it did bite Canadians. And ever since, we've been in a situation where, because of the astute and disciplined political action by the Khalistani movement in Canada, they've been effectively silenced. They don't want to antagonize people who are going to vote for them en masse. And remember, I think Indians know about the vote bank politics that is an important element in this entire story. The point is that these ridings, these districts, electoral districts, in which there is a predominant Indian population, people from the Indian diaspora, that those districts tend to influence how federal elections turn out in Canada. They're what we call swing ridings. They could go either way, so it's important to get those particular ridings. And where we stand today, of course, is that Canada is still not really confronting those problems, the infiltration into mainstream Canadian politics of Khalistani sympathizers. I mean, we know, obviously, I think Indians know now, certainly, everyone knows that the Trudeau minority government is sustained by the votes of a left-wing party, the NDP, which is led by Jagmeet Singh, who's been a lifelong Khalistani sympathizer. There's no way around it. And as long as that situation continues, you're not going to see the Canadian government going after Khalistani activities and trying to, for example, crack down on these posters, the martyr posters, the killer posters, the diorama illustrating the assassination of Indira Gandhi, and the like. However, having said all of that, and it's pretty bad, I don't deny it in any way at all, this is all the background. It doesn't bear on the point that brings us here today, namely Canada's accusation that India got so fed up with this that it came into Canada and committed murder. Now, we've heard a couple of times already in this broadcast, have we not, that Canada hasn't produced specific evidence. Well, that's the Indian story. But what I'm hearing from Canadian leaks, it's not official, so you can take it for what it's worth. But the Canadians claim that, yes, indeed, for weeks, in Trudeau's phrase, many weeks ago, Canada started at the official level approaching the Indians saying, look, we've got some evidence here that one of your guys may have been involved. We'd like you to work with us on solving this case and making sure and finding out whether this is true or not. And that, according to the Canadians, Indian officials did not deny it in private, in those meetings at the official level. prior
I have
to
a point to that.
the meeting between Trudeau and Modi at the G20.
Okay, both
That
the
is what
guests
they
want to
claim,
make a point, Mr.
and
Milewski.
they haven't proved it, but
I
they
request you
might.
to hear them out. Prabhloch Singh, despite the Prime Minister of Canada making a great show of it and, going public with the allegations, India has maintained that if you have a specific information, do share the lead with us.
Yes, I mean, and it's a reasonable request, isn't it?
Mr. Singh.
So, it has been Canada's stand in the past, and I would like to quote, and Canada has gone on record to say in the past that intelligence is not evidence. So if the Canadian side has shared some kind of intelligence with India, that does not amount to evidence. And that is the stand that Canada has really stood by in the past. And the second thing is, if the Canadian Prime Minister and the Honorable Prime Minister of Canada, and if Canada is really worried about Canadian citizens on Canadian soil dying, then why there was no such statement made or action taken or concern shown when Karima Baloch, a Pakistani activist, Canadian citizen, died on Canadian soil? And the irony is that Karima Baloch was not even a designated terrorist. She was just an activist. But there was nothing done when she was found dead. So it is not about, that if a Canadian citizen dies on Canadian soil, that, it really worries the Prime Minister, because we've seen absolute silence from the Canadian side on in the case of Karima Baloch. But when it came to a designated terrorist, we see so much of hue and cry. And they say they've shared, our fellow Mr. Terry. Terry shared that, he's heard that, Canadian side has shared evidence for weeks. Well, they may have shared intelligence is what we hear about. And it's been the Canadian stand that intelligence is not evidence. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, you're not wrong. I mean, I think that it is a fair point, and I can't argue with you, sir, that what the Canadians have shared, well, number one, it remains shrouded in mystery. I mean, is it evidence? Is it intelligence? We don't really know. And until Trudeau puts his cards on the table and says, okay, I'm going to lay it out now, and here's the evidence, or that's what he calls it, evidence. And until that happens, we can't decide the issue. However, remember that this cuts both ways. I think it's fair to point out that for many years, Canada has been complaining that Indian officials seem to expect that if they say, okay, well, he's a designated terrorist, whether or not there's hard evidence produced, we expect Canada to give him up. But we have a legal process. You want to extradite somebody, you got to produce evidence, not intelligence, evidence that we can put before a court and that will stand up
Captain
before Canadian legal standards. So if we don't have that, what do you expect us to do?
Yes, India has in the past shared dossiers with Canada on the issue, isn't it?
There is no doubt. We have been sharing information with Canada, telling them what these Khalistanis have been indulging in, how they have been threatening Indian citizens, how they have been inciting people to violence, but Canada has done nothing. And in fact, it is consistent Canadian denial of any actions against these people that I think India has been stirred to some sort of an action. And as rightly brought out by Mr. Singh, intelligence cannot be an evidence, and that has been the stated policy of Canada. But what is more important is Karima Baloch's case. I think Karima Baloch was an activist. She was a peaceful. She is not indulging in any violence. She was not inciting anybody in violence, and she was found drowned. And I think despite all Baloch activists reiterating that her murder is suspicious, her husband saying there was no reason for her to commit suicide, the Canadian police has proclaimed that it was a suicide. Now, the contrast that with Mr. Brar, I think shows how Canadians have been biased as far as these issues are concerned.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the broadcast with your views. Well, the political convenience behind the inaction has been called out today. A strong statement by External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar while addressing the UNGA. Let's listen in.
Mr. President, we must never again allow an injustice like vaccine apartheid to recur. climate action, too, cannot continue to witness an evasion of historical responsibilities. The power of markets should not be utilized to steer food and energy from the needy to the wealthy. Nor must we countenance that political convenience determines responses to terrorism, extremism, and violence. Similarly, respect for territorial integrity and non-interference in internal affairs cannot be exercises in cherry-picking. When reality departs from the rhetoric, we must have the courage to call it out.